Have you ever heard that the Bible describes huge beings who lived among humans? What almost no one explains is that these stories about the Nephilim might point to something much bigger than just ancient tales. There are layers of mystery, attempts to erase records, and connections to times of great spiritual rebellion. They raise questions about origin, purpose, and even about what might still happen. In this video, we'll go through biblical texts, historical clues, and theories that link these giants to prophetic events, showing why this topic keeps coming back so strongly. Watch until the end to understand the connection between the past and our time, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next studies. Turn on the notification bell and share it with anyone who loves digging deeper into the Bible beyond the obvious. The Nephilim appear in one of the most intriguing passages of the Bible. In Genesis 6:4, we read that there were giants on the earth when the sons of God joined with the daughters of men, and from them came mighty and famous men. This account raises questions. Who were these sons of God? How did such an extraordinary generation come about? The term Nephilim is often understood to mean fallen ones, suggesting beings connected to a spiritual rebellion. Many scholars argue that they were angels who left their place and, with human women, produced a hybrid lineage that showed strength and influence beyond the ordinary. Others see it as symbolic language referring to oppressive powers and kingdoms. Whatever the interpretation, the text points to a corrupted world. Shortly after Genesis 6:5 says that wickedness had spread and human thoughts were corrupted. The presence of the Nephilim then serves as a sign that the created order had been broken and that God was about to act, preparing the judgment that would come with the flood, and showing that he does not ignore humanity's persistence in following paths contrary to his purpose. The story of these giants, therefore, is not just a curious detail, but a warning about the limits of human rebellion before the Creator. The presence of the Nephilim came to represent more than just violence. It was a sign that creation had drifted away from its divine purpose. Then comes the inevitable question. When the flood came and everything was wiped out, what happened to these beings? Were they all destroyed, or did something of them survive the judgment? The biblical account itself gives a clue when it says there were giants in those days, and also afterward, leaving open the possibility of continuity. That's where the story becomes even more intriguing. The flood, according to Genesis 7:23, wiped out all forms of life, sparing only Noah and those with him in the ark, which would suggest the definitive end of the Nephilim. But centuries later, in Numbers 13:33, the spies of Israel claimed to have seen men of extraordinary height and described themselves as grasshoppers compared to them. If the earth had been purified, how do we explain their reappearance? One line of interpretation suggests that after the flood, some form of corruption reappeared among certain descendants of Ham, Noah's son, giving rise to peoples marked by this unusual heritage. So the theme of giants is not just a curious detail from the past, but a thread connecting the ancient world to later episodes in biblical history, suggesting that the struggle against this distortion didn't end with the waters of judgment. This theory doesn't deny the scope of the flood, but shows that the human heart could still be an entry point for ancient influences. That's why studying the Nephilim also means looking at how spiritual rebellion keeps trying to come back. The Bible gives hints that after the flood, something strange was still at work on the earth. Deuteronomy 2 mentions the Amim and the Rephaim, numerous and tall people like the Anakim, who lived in the regions of Canaan. They weren't just strong nations. They seemed to represent the continuation of a lineage that stood against God's plan for Israel. This raises the question, did the judgment of the flood wipe out only flesh and blood? Or was there also a spiritual dimension that allowed this seed of giants to return? By describing these peoples as great and feared, the text shows that they were more than just a historical detail. They were obstacles to the fulfillment of the promise. When Israel approached the Promised Land, They realized it was occupied by well-fortified cities and people of impressive stature. Joshua 11 tells us that the Israelite leader destroyed the Anakim from the mountains of Judah and Israel, as well as from places like Hebron, Debir, and Anab, showing that these tribes were spread across key points of the territory. Deuteronomy 2:20-21 also mentions the Zamzummim, Emim, and Rephaim with the same description: numerous, tall, and living in strongholds. The repetition is not accidental. The Bible is showing that Israel's entry into Canaan was also a spiritual and historical cleansing. God was removing an ancient presence that insisted on occupying the place he had set apart for his people, proving that no power, human or unseen, could stop the advance of his plan. These nations were settled in high regions like Bashan and the mountainous areas of Canaan, reinforcing the idea of dominance and resistance. It wasn't just a fight for fertile land, but for authority over the territory where God intended to manifest his kingdom. The account in Numbers 13:28 shows the spies amazed as they saw huge cities surrounded by walls and inhabited by people who seemed impossible to defeat. It wasn't just the physical strength of those inhabitants that was intimidating. It was the fear they stirred even in the bravest soldiers. Each of those battles, however, went beyond military strategy. They were moments when God's people had to prove before powerful nations that the land belonged to the Lord. Among those enemies rose a figure who stood out as a symbol of that opposition: Og, king of Bashan. Deuteronomy 3:11 says he was the last remaining descendant of a line of giants and even describes the size of his iron bed, about 13 feet long and 6 feet wide, showing his extraordinary height. His presence represented the final resistance of a power that seemed unbeatable. By defeating him, God taught Israel that the promise didn't depend on the number of warriors or the size of the enemy, but on the faithfulness of the one leading them. So every account of giants isn't just a historical record. It's a reminder that the greatest battle has always been spiritual, and that trust in the Lord is what turns closed territories into a secure inheritance. Og ruled over Bashan, a fertile and strategic region tied to the promise made to Israel. As long as he remained there, it seemed to block God's purpose from being fully accomplished. Joshua 12:4-6 records that this king, the last remnant of a line of giants, was defeated, and that his land was given to the people. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a sign that the divine covenant prevails even over forces that dare to challenge heaven. The Bible highlights Og because he represents the continuation of the giants after the flood, and shows that God's people were also fighting a spiritual battle. These giants symbolize the resistance that rises up against the Lord's plan. Even after Og's fall, they appear again in important moments. The most famous example is David and Goliath. In 1 Samuel 17:4, Goliath is described as a warrior nearly 10 feet tall, a figure capable of paralyzing Israel with fear. And 2 Samuel 21:15-22 reminds us that he wasn't the only one. Others from the same lineage also rose up, but one by one they were defeated. So Scripture shows a pattern. When God leads his people into their inheritance, enemies greater than them appear, not to defeat them, but to reveal God's power working on behalf of those who trust in him. The story of Og sets the stage for understanding David facing Goliath. It wasn't just a young man against an experienced warrior. It was the same God bringing down yet another figure who dared to challenge his plan. Each giant defeated reminded Israel that the promise never depended on the size of the enemy. Throughout Israel's history, other warriors appeared who were connected to that same giant lineage that once stood against God's people. Some were so unusual that one of them had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a mark of a feared and distinct bloodline. But the episode that defines this whole picture is David and Goliath. David, still young and without battle training, stepped into the valley armed only with a sling and 5 stones, and defeated the Philistine champion because he trusted that God was leading that battle. That encounter showed that it's not the size of the enemy that determines the outcome, but God's authority over history. Even so, the ongoing presence of these descendants of the ancient Nephilim raises questions. Why did God allow new confrontations? The Bible seems to suggest there was a larger conflict, one in which every victory reaffirmed divine authority over both human and spiritual forces resisting his purpose. Interestingly, many cultures preserve similar memories. The Titans of Greece or the Jotnar of the North also speak of giants who challenged heaven. These echoes point to humanity's desire to explain powers that go beyond the ordinary. Accounts from many peoples, including indigenous tribes of the Americas, mention gigantic beings said to have lived ages ago. When so many distant traditions talk about giants, it's hard not to wonder if they all carry the same core memory. Archaeology adds another layer to this mystery. Bones described as unusually large and colossal constructions appear in different parts of the world. Monuments like Stonehenge, the Egyptian pyramids, and the massive platforms of Baalbek keep raising the same question. How were such heavy stones moved and lifted? For some, the answer might lie in those ancient titans, perhaps the same ones mentioned in sacred texts. Even though many discoveries are debated or dismissed, the fact that reports and investigations keep surfacing keeps this possibility alive and fuels the desire to understand what really happened. At the very least, these clues remind us that human history might be bigger than what we've recorded. The discovery of unusual skeletons always raises the same question. Are they traces of those giants mentioned in Scripture or just human mistakes? The Bible gives hints that people of extraordinary height existed, but it doesn't reveal all the details. It shows that at certain points in history, God used Israel as an instrument to bring an end to lineages marked by spiritual rebellion. Joshua 11 tells that the Anakim were driven out from the mountains and their cities destroyed, as part of a divine judgment meant to cleanse the land. Even so, centuries later, figures like Goliath and his relatives appear, signs that some groups survived or spread out. Over time, though, the Bible mentions them less and less, suggesting they were defeated, absorbed by other peoples, or simply disappeared from the biblical scene. What remained were scattered memories. In myths, accounts of conquests, and here and there possible traces that reignite curiosity about what kind of beings once walked among humans. Maybe that's why so many cultures speak of colossal heroes and wars against supernatural creatures. They're echoes of the same ancient memory, seen from different angles. The Bible tells that the presence of giants wasn't just a curious detail. It was a direct obstacle to God's plan for Israel. These peoples represented rebellion, power set up against divine rule. That's why when God allowed their elimination, it wasn't just ancient violence, but part of a process to cleanse the land so that his chosen people could take root and fulfill their calling. Even so, the question remains, did they really disappear? The biblical accounts close the subject within Israel's wars. Yet throughout history, theories have emerged suggesting that some legacy of these beings might have survived through the centuries. Some point to legends of giant peoples, mysterious discoveries, or stories from remote regions, like caves and mountains, where supposed giants were said to have been seen. Others imagine that fragments of their DNA might have been mixed into humanity, maybe among groups known for their unusual height. There are also those who believe what survived wasn't the body, but the memory, myths, traditions, and stories from ancient cultures that preserved, in symbolic form, the remembrance of colossal beings who once rose up against God. So even without conclusive proof, the figure of the giant still serves as a sign of something greater, a humanity trying to assert its own rule before the Creator, and a God who, in his timing, restores his order. Could it be that the myths of ancient peoples, like the Titans of Greece or the Jotnar of the north, carry ancient echoes of the stories about the Nephilim, retold until they took on new faces. Enigmatic monuments like Baalbek or Göbekli Tepe keep alive the idea that gigantic beings might have built works that seem far beyond the means of their time. But more than archaeological curiosity, this touches on a theological issue. Figures of great power tied to rebellion almost always symbolize resistance to God's purpose. And what if today that kind of opposition isn't physical but spiritual, working against the advance of the kingdom? The Bible suggests that ancient realities can reappear in new forms. In Matthew 24:37, Jesus warns that the end will have something of the days of Noah, which calls us to stay alert and discerning about what could return, not to spread fear, but so that God's people remain steadfast. The statement pushes us back to the days before the flood and makes us ask what kind of reality was at play back then. If there were giants involved in humanity's downfall, could something similar happen again near the end? The mention in Genesis 6:4 says there were giants in those days and also afterward, a detail many scholars see as a clue that the phenomenon wasn't limited to the past. Connecting this to the angels who, according to Jude 1:6, abandoned their proper place, the idea arises that spiritual influences might still be at work today, maybe in subtle ways, feeding processes of corruption. When we look at modern science and technology, especially in areas related to genetics, the question becomes even more serious. Could humanity itself, driven by ambition and curiosity, recreate conditions similar to those ancient ones, and repeat the same mistake that once brought judgment to the world? This possibility doesn't depend only on supernatural beings showing up again, but on the path humans choose to follow. If divine principles are ignored and moral boundaries are broken, space opens up for old forms of rebellion to return in modern disguises. The giants described in the Bible can be seen as more than extraordinary beings from the past. They point to a real opposition to God's purpose, a force that tries to pull humanity away from obedience and faith. And according to Scripture, this resistance will become even stronger as the return of Christ draws near. This opposition can show up spiritually, culturally, or even within us, but always with the same goal: to turn the human heart away. When we remember the Nephilim, the Anakim, and Goliath, we see that the focus isn't just on their might, but on the response of those who trust in the Lord. The question is, are we living in days like those of Noah, surrounded by symbolic giants such as fear, sin, unbelief, and spiritual confusion? What are the giants in your life? Problems that seem bigger than you, temptations that keep coming back, voices that try to discourage you. When we recognize these signs, we realize this isn't about theological curiosity, but about being prepared to stand firm when the whole world seems to move in the opposite direction of God's will. The Bible shows that victory doesn't come from human strength, but from surrender. David won because he went in the name of the Lord, and that same God is still at work today. He still raises ordinary people to face gigantic challenges and prove that the power is His, not ours. This is a daily walk of faith and vigilance, so don't walk alone. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video so more people can be awakened. Let's keep exploring the mysteries of the Word together and strengthening our faith.